It's the 26th of August, 1346, and a young English prince is in hand-to-hand combat with the French, holding the right flank of his father's army. He sends a messenger to his father, the king, placed upon a hill, saying that he was outnumbered and needed more men, or his position would be overrun. The king, hearing that his son was in dire need, replied, "Let the boy win his spurs." Hello and welcome to Harrison's History. The young English prince is Edward the Black Prince, also known as Edward Woodstock of England. In this video we'll be talking about his adventures. He was regarded as a great warrior, a great leader, benevolent when needed, and displayed all the chivalric virtues that a knight strove for in that time. And that is just scratching the surface of the prince's character. The man was a legend, and his achievements can't be understated. He's known as one of the greatest kings England ever had, and it's one of those fascinating what ifs. If Edward the Black Prince lived longer and made it to be King of England, what would have happened and what would have been different in our history? If you enjoy the video and like the work that I have done, then please subscribe and give the video a like, and comment down below what you thought. I'm always looking for ways to improve, as I'm still very new to this, and it helps enormously. It gives me an idea of what you guys like and what direction I can move the channel in. With that said, let's get on with the video. So let's start with Edward's early life. He was born on the 15th of June 1330 at Woodstock Palace in Oxfordshire, England. He would be named Edward Woodstock. His father was King Edward III of England. His mother was Philippa of Hanau. He was the eldest son of Edward III, and being the heir to the throne, he received tutelage in warfare, knightly values such as the chivalric code, religion, and how to properly govern a realm. The young prince, by all accounts, excelled at these and took great interest. He was made the Duke of Cornwall at the age of 7, and this was also when he received his first set of armour. The young prince had a passion for jousting, and at the age of 13 he entered his first tournament, and the same year he was crowned the Prince of Wales. The backdrop to Edward's childhood was a stormy one. Several times England was threatened with invasion from France, where the young Edward would be rushed off to the castle of Nottingham for his own safety. His grandfather was deposed of the English throne by his own grandmother for her own benefit. However, this was before Woodstock was born. For a lot of his childhood, Edward's father, Edward III, was away fighting. He was fighting the Scots or the French, winning battles like Halidon Hill in 1333 against the Scots, or the Battle of Sluis in 1340, where under the command of King Edward III, an English fleet took on the French fleet twice its size, and captured the entire French fleet. The French kings were always looking to take away English-held lands on the continent. The young prince must have grown up in an atmosphere fueled by war and conflict. French monarchs systematically sought to check the growth of English power on the continent, stripping away lands as the opportunity arose. Over the centuries, English holdings in France had varied in size, but by 1337, only Gascony in southwestern France and Poitiers in northern France were left. The independent-minded Gascons had their own customs and their own language. A large proportion of the red wine they produced was shipped to England in a profitable trade. The Gascons preferred their relationship with the English, who were light-handed in rule generally and let them have a large degree of autonomy, whereas the French kings tended to interfere in their affairs. Following a series of disagreements between Philip VI of France and Edward III of England, on the 24th of May 1337, Philip's Great Council in Paris agreed that the Duchy of Aquitaine, which is effectively Gascony, should be taken back into Philip's hands, and also with various English claims to the French throne in the background. This was to mark the start of the 100 Years' War, which was to last 116 years, and the continuation of a long and proud tradition of both nations trying to kill each other. Edward III claimed the French throne, as he was one of two men who had claims to the throne. He put his claim forward in 1337. In the year 1346, Edward III planned an invasion of French Normandy. He'd been planning this for some time, raising taxes, gathering supplies, and levying an army. In 1340, Edward III declared himself the King of France in Ghent, which was in the Low Countries, and combined the coat of arms of England and France, joining the Leopards of England and the French fleurs-de-lis. On the 12th of July, Edward III landed in Normandy, with his son, Edward the Black Prince, by his side, who was eager to join in and win the glory. The army was around 14,000 strong, with a large contingent of longbowmen, which the French were quickly learning to fear. This was a campaign where the Black Prince would establish himself as one of the greatest knights and leaders of the medieval period. Prince Edward was knighted in front of his army at La Hire, and he was given command of the English vanguard. The plan of the English was to lay waste to the agricultural lands of Normandy. This was referred to as a chevauchée. This meant raiding and burning of towns and villages, burning of crops. Looking at it today, it was a harsh way of making war, but in the 1300s and 1400s it was the common tactic of European armies. In July of 1346, the English besieged Caen, a major stronghold in Normandy, with the French defenders of the city numbering around 1,500, and a larger force of armed townsmen. On the 25th of July, English peace terms were sent to Caen, saying all lives and property would be spared if the town surrendered. These were rejected, and the emissary imprisoned. The next day, the English attacked. Seeing the French had left a part of the old town undefended, it was quickly seized. King Edward formed up the rest of his men, ready to take key bridges into the town. English men-at-arms and longbowmen charged the bridges, leading to a furious melee on the bridges, then into the town. With gaps in the French defence, they were quickly overwhelmed. The town belonged to the English, with limited losses on the English side by the end of the day. Then begun, as was the norm in the time, an orgy of drunken violence, looting, murder, and rape by the English common soldiers on the French citizens. However, it is documented that English knights did all they could to intervene and stop the violence, saving many women from rape and possible death. After the siege, King Edward paid tribute to William the Conqueror's grave, which was in the town itself. Edward the Black Prince played a key role in the battle. At the vanguard of the army, he may well have been in the thick of the action. On the 1st of August, the English army moved out towards Paris. Criticism mounted of the French king, being unable to defend his lands and protect his people from the English army. On the 14th of August, he sent a letter to King Edward, challenging him to battle, which is what the English had wanted all this time. The English marched north to choose a battleground. They arrived on a ridge of high ground near the village of Crécy. Here is where the legend of the Black Prince would truly begin. The English army had around 2,500 men-at-arms, 3,000 cavalry, 2,000 spears, and 5,000 to 7,000 longbowmen. The army numbered around 13,000 men in total, whereas the French army heavily outnumbered the English, and they had around 30,000 French soldiers. King Edward commanded the centre on a hill by a windmill, where the 16-year-old Prince Edward held the right flank, which was further forward than the rest of the English army, and it would bear the brunt of the fighting that day. On the 26th of August, the armies lined up to face each other. The English longbows formed up in between the men-at-arms and spearmen. The longbow, which was unique to the English and Welsh, took around 10 years to master and could fire well over 300 metres, a fierce weapon in the right hands. The French took position on the other side of the plain, led by King Philip VI and King John the Blind of Bohemia. The flower of French nobility was on full display, with many nobles and counts in the battle line. The attack started with French Genoese crossbowmen advanced to take on the longbows, but the massive volleys of the longbows saw them off quickly. The French cavalry, who had arranged behind the crossbows, seeing them waver, decided to charge, galloping straight through the crossbowmen, seeing them as cowards, and even hacking some of them down. The heavily mailed knights charged the English lines. King John of Bohemia, tied to his horse, led a charge on the English right, held by Prince Edward. The longbows fell back behind the men-at-arms, and a vicious melee ensued. The young Prince Edward was beaten to the ground and saved by his standard-bearer. Prince Edward, badly concussed, continued to fight on. Seeing his lines wavering, he called on his father for aid. Initially, the king said no, but eventually sent 20 knights as a relief force. The melee continued, with fresh French cavalry charges sent over and over to try and break the English lines. The fighting was brutal and without pity. Men were trampled underfoot, bodies suffocated in the mud. The French Count of Blois led an assault on foot, where later his body would be found dead in the mud. King Philip himself had 2 horses under him, killed in the fighting, and as night drew in, the fighting was done, and the French were routed. It was a terrible defeat for the French, and a heroic victory for the English. One of the greatest of the medieval age. Prince Edward well and truly won his spurs in this battle. The English sustained less than 300 men lost, whilst the French losses are estimated at around 13,000, with a great many nobles in the death toll, including King John of Bohemia. Prince Edward came across his body when surveying the battlefield. He was deeply moved, as John, in his time, was a great warrior, losing his sight on crusade. John's emblem was 3 white feathers. The prince took these as his own emblem, and are still the emblem of the Prince of Wales now. Both the King and Prince Edward then moved to take the port city of Calais, which surrendered in August 1347. That year, King Edward negotiated a truce and returned to London. Having won glory, Prince Edward now got his independence, gaining his own household of knights, priests and clerks. He took an active role in tending to his estates. He gained a reputation as being generous to those around him, giving money and great gifts to those who did well in his service. This would be the start of Edward's money problems, which would plague him for the rest of his life. All did not go smoothly for the young prince for long. The Black Death soon arrived in August 1348, killing between 40 and 60% of England's population, ravaging the country on a scale not seen since the plague of Justinian. Prince Edward was impacted by the disease personally, as it claimed the life of his sister Joan, the plague having no care for royalty or peasant alike. In the year 1349, King Edward created the Chivalric Order of the Garter, where young Prince Edward was one of its first members. This was an order of great knights whom displayed valour and did great deeds for the realm. The prince helps pick these first members. The Order of the Garter still remains the most senior order of knights that remains in Britain today. In 1349, the plague had dissipated. War with the French picked up again, and with word that the French were moving to retake Calais, both king and prince moved out to intercept them. On the 1st of January 1350, they sprung a trap and defeated the French in a bloody battle. The prince led the garrison to save his father when he was cut off outside the city, proving once again his bravery and honour on the battlefield. The prince by this stage had many estates, and after the Black Death showed himself to be a tough but fair landlord, telling his revenue official in Cornwall in 1351 to protect the people from oppression and extortion and deal rightly with them. After local unrest in the county of Cheshire, the prince travelled there to hold sessions in front of the people to hear their grievances, and granted them more liberties, in the Charter of Liberties as it was going to come to known. Prince Edward was fair and just, but he gained a reputation as a overindulgent spender, as he continued with his gift-giving and his extravagant lifestyle with amazing feasters and a rich court. But this kept the men on his side. In 1355, the French were taking English towns in Gascony by John, the Count of Armagnac, under the orders of the new King John II of France. On the 24th of May, an English war council decided the Black Prince Edward would lead an army in Gascony and retake towns and beat the French forces in the area. Prince Edward was made the King's lieutenant in Gascony, allowing him more power in the area. He went with an army of 2,600 men, which was bolstered by local Gascon soldiers, along with 14 Knights of the Garter, including Earls of Warwick and Suffolk, along with John Chandos and Sir James Audley, who were close friends of the prince. The prince's plan, as he said in a speech to the people of Bordeaux, was to march east and ravage the lands of the French governor of Languedoc in a great chevauchée. With a total of 8,000 men, the prince set off following the river Garonne in October. Villages started burning and fires raged for miles around. Castles were plundered. Though out of piety, the prince ordered much of church property to be spared. The French army in the region was much larger, but John of Armagnac in command did not want to fight the prince, so gathered his army in Toulouse, destroying bridges in the prince's way. On the 28th of October, the prince reached the Garonne, 8 miles away from Toulouse. The river was fast flowing, but local guides showed the prince a way across, and his army forged the river in a single day. This boosted the mood of the English and terrified the French, who assumed the English would be turned back when faced with the river. The prince moved into Languedoc, which was ill prepared, and the region was sacked completely. The prince's troops had covered 250 miles since Bordeaux, and were now in sight of the Mediterranean. The prince made the decision to turn back to Gascony before the winter set in. Turning west, they burned everything in their path. Though the Prince Edward visited many religious houses and churches to pray on the way back. On the 28th of November, the prince arrived back on English Gascon soil, and spent the Christmas of 1355 there, amid great celebrating of the local populace with the success of the prince, rallying many French lords to the English cause, seeing the force and speed of Prince Edward's raid. However, he made an enemy of the Count of Armagnac, whose lands he had plundered. In June of 1356, King Edward sent the Duke of Lancaster with an army to Normandy, and ordered the prince to march north and link up with Lancaster, with the objective of attacking the French king's son in Poitiers. The prince left 2,000 of his 8,000 men behind to defend Gascony against raids from the Count of Armagnac. The prince marched north with 6,000 men on the 4th of August 1356, avoiding well-defended towns and castles. But as the prince neared the Loire River, he realised that Lancaster had ended his campaign in Normandy after sighting a much larger French force. The French had assembled a force of over 12,000 men, and the prince now became desperate to link up with Lancaster, learning he was heavily outnumbered after a skirmish between his vanguard and a French reconnaissance force. Lancaster had withdrawn into Brittany, leaving the prince to fight alone. The French managed to cut across the prince's army at a place named Poitiers, and after a brief fight with the French rearguard, it was clear a major fight was coming Edward's way. Prince Edward, with around 7,000 men, faced King John, who had around 20,000 men. The prince chose his location at Poitiers in a strong natural position, on a ridge, with woods on one side and a steep escarpment on the other. The prince placed Warwick and Oxford's division on his left flank, and Suffolk and Salisbury on his right, while he commanded the centre, with longbows on either flank. Before the battle, John Chandos writes that a local cardinal attempted to broker a truce between the two armies, with the French demanding the English army surrender in total, which was flat out rejected by Edward. On the 19th of September, the French formed up in 3 divisions. Edward took his supply wagons and drove them away, making it look like his force was withdrawing. This was to convince the French army to attack, and it worked. The French heavy cavalry charged the English line and crashed into the English. But only the horses in the front line were armoured, and after repositioning to the extreme flanks, the longbows let loose deadly volleys on unarmed knights. Behind the French cavalry, the French infantry advanced and were battered with arrows. The English, drawing the French in, then flanked the numerically superior French force, and after 2 hours, beat 2 out of the 3 French divisions. Seeing the mass confusion in front of him, King John, in command of the 3rd Division, advanced. But the Black Prince had a plan, and had hidden a cavalry force in the woods to intercept them, and to fall on the French left. The English longbows, having used their arrows, threw down their bows, and charged into the melee. The French king was surrounded, and after a last stand was captured by Prince Edward. The Black Prince had won a great victory for the English, with thousands of French dead, with only 340 English lives lost, winning an almost impossible victory with his tactics and leadership at Poitiers, and it would be remembered as one of the greatest victories of medieval England. The captured King John was treated with respect by the Black Prince, who praised the king's valour and bravery, waiting at the king's table when he ate out of respect for him. The tenets of chivalry were bravery in battle and respecting the enemy. The Black Prince displayed both of these qualities. This is why he is remembered as a chivalrous warrior. He returned to Gascon on the 5th of October, where he then went and sailed back to England in May of 1357, parading his captured French nobles and the king to the cheering crowds. In 1348, a truce was signed with the French in favour of England, ceding land and having to pay large sums of money to the English. Following this, the prince started an extensive building projects in his lands and quickly fell back into debt, building an abbey in Cheshire. He also rewarded his followers heavily, who were in the Poitiers campaign with him. A common theme for the Black Prince was his money woes, and possibly one of his greatest failures. With the French delaying their debt payments, King Edward and the Black Prince moved on the French city of Reims, but met stubborn resistance, and after a storm ravaged their army, they fell back. Another peace treaty was signed with the French, ceding around 1/3 of their territory to the English. In 1361, at the age of 31, the Black Prince chose to marry. This was very late for a prince at that time. Usually they married in their teens. But Edward had had a busy life so far, so I guess he put it off. He married Joan of Kent. The prince, it seemed, married for love, going against his father's wishes of a rich continental bride. By account, the prince was infatuated with Joan, and her likewise. On the 19th of July, he was invested as the Prince of Aquitaine in a ceremony at Westminster Abbey. The prince then left England the next summer with his household and 600 men, arriving in Gascony on the 29th of June. He toured across Aquitaine, accepting fealty from his new lords, gifting them generously, and his huge lavish court was uplifting to the war-ravaged land. Edward and Joan were both extremely happy in their new land. Adding to this was the birth of their first child in January 1365, who was called Edward, just to add extra confusion with all the other Edwards. He again, in councils, listened to his local grievances and worked to reduce lawlessness in his lands after hearing of bandits and feuding lords. In 1366, the King of Castile, Pedro, was deposed by a pro-French monarch, Enrique. Pedro went to the Prince Edward, asking for help to get his crown back. Pedro was a valuable ally when he was king, but he brought no soldiers with him in his rapid evacuation, and had little funds as well. So the prince and his court were very wary about helping him, as they would have to do the fighting and pay for it themselves. Pedro was also known as a tyrant, and had been excommunicated by the church, which greatly disturbed and repelled Edward, who led a strict life of piety and love of the church. Nevertheless, King Edward, who was keen to keep the English-Castilian alliance, with the prince's loyalty to his father overriding his doubts, he reluctantly signed a treaty to help Pedro win back the throne in 1366. But Edward the Black Prince put the condition in that Pedro must amend his life and government and repair his relations with the church if the English were to help him. Prince Edward had another son on the 6th of January 1367, who he named Richard, who would later be King Richard II of England. On the 14th of February, the prince's army of 6,000 strong crossed the Pyrenees mountains, with the vanguard leading the way under John Chandos, reaching Pamplona on the 23rd of February. As the army was encamped around Vitoria, it suffered harsh weather conditions and was ambushed on the 25th of March by a Franco-Spanish force under Enrique, losing hundreds of men. The prince, it seems, was spurred into action by this, and after falling back to Navarra, he was exchanging letters with his enemy Enrique, goading him into battle. And on the 3rd of April, the two armies met on a plain near the town of Niger. Enrique holding the numbers advantage, but the Black Prince holding the element of surprise. He shielded his advance behind a ridge appearing on their left flank. In shock, Enrique's army launched a poorly coordinated attack on the English lines, which were mauled by longbowmen. Castilians were not accustomed to the devastation of the longbow, and what it could reap on the battlefield. The longbows dealt a heavy blow on the advancing infantry, and the prince, seeing the crucial moment in the battle, charged his men forward into the Castilian lines, routing them and winning the battle. It was a complete victory with little losses on the English side. On the 2nd of May, Pedro was presented with the cost he owed Prince Edward for getting his crown back. Edward intended to remain in Spain to make sure the debt was paid, but an outbreak of dysentery ran through his army, which struck the prince too, making him grievously ill. The English marched back to English-held Gascon in September of 1367. The Black Prince was now on the verge of bankruptcy, with Pedro not paying his debts, so he was forced to introduce new taxes on his lands. The prince now lacked the financial means to maintain the loyalty of his French vassals, and he was still in poor health, suffering from dysentery, which continually plagued him for the rest of his life. The new King of France, Charles V, saw his opportunity. While the prince was weak, he struck, buying the loyalty of the prince's vassals, pledging to fight for them if the prince ever tried to attack them. King Edward III was declining in years, and now in ill health. He was no longer as decisive as he once was. He failed to provide his son with adequate funds and men to protect his lands. In a further blow, Enrique retook Castile and killed Pedro in 1369, making Edward's earlier campaign seem like it was for nothing, and placing an enemy directly to his south. In June 1369, war broke out once again. A small force under the Earl of Cambridge was sent to assist the Black Prince's forces in Gascony. Vulnerable towns began to fall to the French in Aquitaine. The prince was still crippled by illness, and furthermore, he began to lose some of his closest friends and military companions, like Sir James Audley, who died from sickness in 1369, and Sir John Chandos, who was killed in a skirmish with the French in the same year. These would have been a deep personal blow to the prince, as they had been with him from the start of his campaigning years. In 1370, the French launched a large offensive with 2 armies, capturing Limoges, after it was surrendered by the Black Prince's close friend, Bishop Jean de Cloch. The majority of the townspeople remained loyal to the English and the Black Prince. The prince was taken back by the loss, and marched an army to retake Limoges, although he had to be carried, as by now he was even too ill to ride a horse. On the 14th of September, the English laid siege. A few days later, the walls came down, allowing the English to surge into the town and push back the French and defeat them. It was an important victory for the English. However, on the 29th of September, Prince Edward learnt of his eldest son's death by the plague. The prince returned to England in January of 1371, where he would live out the rest of his days in ill health in Berkhamsted Castle. As he saw his health worsen, he became even more dedicated to the church, as he suspected his sickness was divine judgment for helping Pedro of Castile, the tyrant king. The Black Prince remained a figure of love and admiration for the English people. As the prince approached the age of 46, he was now unable to leave his bed. Once the finest warrior and brave soldier, now restricted and unable to move. On the 1st of June 1376, he was carried to the Palace of Westminster, so he could spend the last days with his father, who, throughout his life, he had served loyally. And on Sunday, the 8th of June 1376, Edward the Black Prince said a final prayer and passed away. He was buried in Canterbury Cathedral, where his tomb still lies today. The English people despaired at his loss, who said it always felt safe when the prince was alive. Edward was admired by even his enemies. The French king, Charles V, hearing of his passing, held a mass in Paris to honour him. The name the Black Prince was not used when he was alive, but during the Tudor era, so it is believed the name comes from the black armour he wore in battle. Edward Woodstock, the Black Prince, was truly one of the greats of medieval times, winning some of the most iconic victories in the 100 Years' War. He was a symbol of virtue and knightly goodness, and displayed all the chivalric qualities that everyone looked up to in that age. He was truly a hero of the time. He had the loyalty and the love of his soldiers. And so ends the great story of Edward the Black Prince, a short but impactful life. It's a fascinating story, one which you grow up with hearing tales of great knights and chivalric codes. I think he encompasses all of these. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, leave a comment. If you had any ideas for the future or improvements to be made to the video, please leave a comment as well. And if you feel like it, please subscribe. It helps a lot. And thank you for your kind feedback on the last video. It makes a huge difference to me doing it, and it really means a lot to me. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.